If you've been following the recent Super Mario Maker April 8th shutdown drama, you're probably well aware of trimming the herbs. In a crazy twist that not everybody expected, on April 5th, Sanyx 91 SMM2 became the first human to legitimately clear the level after weeks of attempts. Way to go, Sanyx! Looking at the list of clears on the level, you can see that Sanyx isn't listed as the first clear. That's because the prior clears were hacks made on modified consoles or emulators, right? Daniel from Portugal didn't really clear the level first, and obviously the world record of less than a second is fake. Sanyx was the first human player to legitimately beat the level. I'm one of the players on this list. I'm Doug. I'm a very casual Mario Maker player, so I definitely didn't beat it legitimately. However, I'm an embedded software engineer who also likes to tinker with hardware stuff in my spare time. I want to tell the story about how my name ended up on the list of clears. After the news came out that trimming the herbs had been originally uploaded as a TAS, Tool-Assisted Speedrun, which is something that wasn't even known to be possible on the Wii U, I decided it would be an interesting challenge to try to see how far I could get with implementing my own. I started out by opening up a Wii Classic controller and inspecting the circuit board. I would need to be able to press the D-pad, A, Y, and one of the trigger buttons at precise times using a microcontroller. Looking at the PCB, you can see that the circuit for the buttons is pretty simple. Each membrane button makes a connection between a pin on the main chip and ground. The input pins on the main chip are normally at about 3.3 volts, and when you press them, they go down to 0 volts because they're connected directly to ground through the pressed button. You can see there's a big copper fill in the middle of the D-pad, and one end of each button goes to it. That's ground. So I traced out where each button goes on the chip. Basically, I just needed a way to tie these pins to ground from a microcontroller whenever I wanted to press the button. I traced out the same thing on the other side with the A and Y buttons. I could have scraped some solder mask off or damaged the membrane buttons in order to expose some copper to solder to, but I wanted to eventually be able to restore my controller back to its original condition, so I didn't want to make any permanent changes to the board. Instead, I got under the microscope and soldered wires to each of the pins on the microcontroller. This was pretty tedious, but with enough flux and enough luck, I was able to get them all attached. I did accidentally bend a couple of pins on the chip, but I was able to make it work. The ZR button is a normal tactile switch, so I was able to solder directly to a pin on the switch. I also soldered a wire to a capacitor for ground that you can't see in this picture. Next, I just had to solder all of these wires to pins on my Raspberry Pi Pico board. I needed to connect the ground wire to a ground pin on the Pico, and the rest of the wires needed to go to GPIO, General Purpose Input-Output pins. Those are pins that I can control with my Python program. With everything soldered together, I was ready to start actually trying to write some software. I decided to work in MicroPython because it was really easy to test things out live in the Python environment, but I could also run scripts through the Thonny IDE. I wanted to set it up so a button's pin would be driven to ground when I wanted it pressed, and floating when I didn't want it pressed, to match how the membrane buttons work. This is also known as open drain and is used in lots of things in the microcontroller world like I2C. This was really easy to set up with MicroPython. I was quickly able to verify that I could make Mario jump by pressing the A button with this scheme, and then I knew I would be able to at least try something. Next, I set up a simple engine that takes a list of inputs and delays and executes them frame by frame. I started out by setting up a 60 Hz timer and had it use the timer to advance through the list. This worked with some basic testing, so I started trying to come up with my own TAS to beat the level. Well, it turns out creating a TAS isn't easy. It's especially not easy to come up with a list of controller inputs when the results change slightly between attempts. I found that the results with the controller were slightly erratic. Even with a very simple set of outputs for testing, it wasn't 100% repeatable. See this simple setup? Sometimes the bob-omb bounces off Mario's head to the right, and sometimes it doesn't. This is where I knew I wouldn't be able to come up with the inputs myself. My TAS got far enough that it could get past the first plant and onto the second plant, but it wasn't very repeatable. I wondered if maybe my 60 Hz timer wasn't accurate enough, so I decided to look at the HDMI signal to try to keep my inputs fully in sync with the frames generated by the Wii U. For that, I got an Adafruit TFP401 breakout board. The TFP401 is a chip by Texas Instruments that decodes an HDMI or DVI signal into a parallel video signal including VSync, HSync, and pixel clock. That's suitable for sending it to an LCD. I was able to use the VSync output of the TFP401 as a GPIO interrupt to decide when to execute the next frame in my TAS engine. Even with this VSync setup, I still saw intermittent results with my TAS, and I still saw the variation with simple inputs like the bob-omb example from before. I was pretty sure that the Wii U, at least with the Wii Classic controller, had random issues with input accuracy. It was at this point that I reached out to Dwango AC in the TASBot community to see if they had any thoughts or if I could help them out. Dwango invited me to join the TASBot Discord, and that's when I discovered that Ahoyo had already shared the original TAS inputs. I excitedly converted his CSV file into a list of inputs for my MicroPython program and played it back. Spoiler alert, it didn't succeed. I had to tweak the delay between when you press start over and the level actually begins. It turns out that's actually a little random, but I found something that worked pretty well. Once I had it tuned in, it still didn't succeed right away, but I found that sometimes it made it further than other times. It sounded like Ahoyo ran into the exact same problems, so I just kept running it. Within 5 minutes, it had succeeded. I was able to successfully play back the TAS on my Wii U through my modified controller. Now this may be controversial, but I went ahead and played it back in the actual course world so that it would mark me as someone who completed the level. This required tweaking the start over delay because it's different between when you're playing locally and when you're playing in the course world online. Further experimentation in conjunction with the TASBot community seems to have revealed that there's definitely some variance in the controller inputs. If I try to press A for exactly 1 frame, like in this picture, it doesn't always register as a press in Mario Maker. I also ran some tests showing that if I try to press a button at a regular interval, sometimes the Wii U sees it off by a frame. This makes what Sanyx was able to pull off that much more impressive. Not only does it take an incredible amount of skill, you're also fighting against a Wii U or its controller or something in between. Anyway, that's the story of how my name showed up in the clear list for trimming the herbs. Is it a hacked clear? I guess it depends on your definition of hacked. My actual console isn't hacked at all. I just played back Ahoyo's original inputs through a modified controller. Either way, it's definitely not a legitimate clear. Again, hats off to Sanyx for actually beating it.